Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Becoming Counsel. In this episode, we are going to do a deep dive into another contracts law essay question. And the topic today will be around a UCC example. So let's start with the fact pattern. So let's say there's a woodworking company and a restaurant owner. They enter into a written contract, and under the deal, the woodworking shop will build a full set of custom cabinets for the restaurant based on the restaurant owner's specifications. And they're going to sell them to her for $85,000 with a specific delivery date. So let's say they sign the contract March 1st and delivery is due August 1st, just in time for the restaurant's fall opening. And the full payment is due when the cabinets are delivered. So let's say in late May, about 2 months after the contract signed, the woodworking shop's main supplier of hardwood gets hit with a trucking strike. So that means no lumber is coming in because the delivery drivers have worked off the job. Essentially, no replacements available. They're not getting the materials. And by mid June, let's say the strike is still dragging on, but now it's getting into the local news. So the restaurant owner essentially reads about that and starts to panic. She's already announced the opening date to the public for her restaurant, and so she's getting worried. So she reaches out via email, so a written message, to the woodworking shop owner, and she basically says she's worried the cabinets won't be delivered and ready by August 1st. And she essentially is looking for assurances, right? She's looking for written confirmation that the shop can still meet the deadline. Now, the shop doesn't respond immediately. They wait about 3 weeks, and then finally in early July, so about a month out from opening, the owner of the shop writes back and says, let's just say, and essentially says the strike is out of his hands. He's waiting on the union and the supplier to work it out, and he hopes it's resolved soon. Now, 2 more weeks pass after that, and no more communications are going between the woodworking shop and the restaurant. And then all of a sudden in mid July, the shop owner calls the restaurant owner directly and tells her that the strike has ended. His crew is now working double shifts. Her cabinets are the top priority, and they'll be ready by the August 1st contract deadline as promised. Now, at this point, she responds and she says she's already lost confidence in this company. She considers the deal off and isn't going to risk it. Then she goes out and 2 days later finds a different company and signs a contract with them. Well, here's the twist: the original woodworking shop actually finishes the custom cabinets on time, and the shop owner shows up prior to the August 1st deadline, ready to deliver the product, exactly as the contract required. Now, the restaurant owner refuses to accept them or pay, pointing back to that phone call where she said the deal was off. Now, the woodworking shop sues the restaurant for breach of contract. That's the end of the fact pattern. Now, underneath that, you'll get a couple questions. So, whether or not one question might be whether or not there was a valid contract to begin with. Another one could essentially, subsequent question is what is the effect of the written demand of assurances? What's the effect of the shop's initial response? And then what's the legal effect of the phone call and the final refusal? So let's go through that. So let's start with, is there a valid contract? So let's do the IRAC format. So issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion. So the issue is there a valid enforceable contract between these two parties? So in regards to rules, a valid contract requires an offer, acceptance, and consideration. An offer is essentially the manifestation of intent to be bound by certain terms communicated to another party. Acceptance is assent to those terms. And then consideration is a bargain for exchange. Essentially, each side is giving something up of value. There's also the threshold question, right, which the body of law applies. So because this contract is for cabinets, then we know that the contract is for the sale of goods, so that the UCC will be governing this rather than common law. And that matters because the UCC is more flexible when it comes to contract formation than common law is. And so a contract for the sale of goods can be formed in pretty much any manner that shows sufficient agreement and doesn't fail for indefiniteness, even if there's some minor terms left open for interpretation. So let's talk about the analysis piece here. So let's break this down. The shop and restaurant owner had an agreement, right? Custom kitchen cabinets built to spec for $85,000 delivered on August 1st. There was an offer, there was an acceptance, and there was a bargain for exchange. And since the price is over $500, the statute of frauds requirement means that it has to be in writing, which is what essentially they did. Therefore, all the elements of a valid contract under the UCC are met, and there is a valid contract between both parties as of March 1st. So from there, let's look at the next issue, the restaurant owner's written demand. So as we look at, after the restaurant owner is aware of the strike, that's when the restaurant owner sent that email to the woodworking shop owner, essentially demanding confirmation. So under the UCC section 2-609, if a party has reasonable grounds to believe that the other side won't be able to perform, they can demand adequate assurances of performance. Now, this demand has to be in writing. And once you make that demand, you're allowed to suspend your own performance until you get those assurances back. Now, applying that here, the restaurant owner essentially read about the news of the strike in an article or saw on the news, specifically naming the woodworking shop and the effect of the strike on deliveries. And so that was a reasonable concern, right? She was unsure if it was going to make it. And there was a basis for that insecurity. Now, her demand was in writing, it was an email, which satisfies the writing requirement, and it clearly asked for confirmation of performance, basically checking all the boxes under the UCC 2-609. So in regards to this issue, the restaurant owner's written message was a valid and legally effective demand for adequate assurances. So let's go from that to the next issue, the shop's early July response. So now that we've had a legally effective demand, did their initial response satisfy that demand? So from a rule perspective, once you receive a valid demand for assurances, you have to respond with adequate assurances within a reasonable time, capped at 30 days under the UCC. If you don't provide adequate assurances in that window, your non-answer can be treated as repudiation of the contract. And once that happens, the non-repudiating party gets essentially legal options. They can sue immediately, they can suspend performance and wait, they can treat it as an offer to rescind it, or they have the option to ignore the repudiation and keep urging performance. Now, at this point, what this means is the shop responded within 3 weeks. So it's within that 30-day period. So timing isn't the problem. The problem here is the substance. The shop owner's message basically said the strike was out of his hands and he was waiting on the union and supplier to sort it out. That's not an assurance of performance. It's basically saying, I have no control and we'll just kind of wait and see. If anything, this response will make the restaurant owner more nervous, not less. And there's no date, there's no commitment, there's nothing concrete. So in regards to this issue, the shop owner's response failed to provide the adequate assurances that the restaurant owner was entitled to. And essentially, the restaurant owner was basically entitled to treat this as a repudiation. Now that we are at this point, just remember there was no other communication between the restaurant owner and the woodworking shop after this. 2 weeks go by, and then there's a phone call. So let's talk about that phone call. So the issue here is, did that mid-July phone call retract the repudiation and put the contract back in force? Well, under the UCC, a party who's repudiated contract can retract that repudiation. So essentially take that back anytime before a couple things. So before the performance date, they can do it unless the other party has already canceled the contract or materially changed their position in reliance on that repudiation. Otherwise indicated that the repudiation was final. Now, that retraction can be oral or it can be written, but it has to include a clear assurance of intent to perform. So let's walk through this timeline carefully again in the order of events of everything going on. So the phone call was after the shop owner basically asked for an assurance that they'll deliver. They gave pretty much a non-answer. And then there was radio silence. There's no evidence that the restaurant owner did anything afterwards. So when the time of the phone call happened, the shop owner started the conversation with clear, ambiguous assurances. Essentially, the strike is over, the crew's working doubles, we'll get everything done by August 1st, as per the contract. This was a valid retraction as of that call. So what happened after that piece during the same phone call? So after the retraction had already happened, the restaurant owner continued the conversation and basically said, she's done. And then at that point, she goes out and finds a different vendor, different cabinet shop, and signs a contract 2 days later. But when you actually look at it, between the initial response and that phone call, the restaurant owner did not say anything. So they did not accept the repudiation. They did not say the contract was over. They did not materially change their position in reliance to that repudiation. So the woodworking shop had every right to retract that repudiation. Now, once it's retracted, that contract is now enforceable again. So as of that phone call, the contract had been reinstated the moment the shop owner gave those assurances on the phone. So now that we've gone through that, I just want to mention a few things that I think would help when you're taking a contracts law exam. So first off, never skip the formation question just because it seems obvious, right? So professors will put that in there. Make sure you talk about offer, acceptance, and consideration, and make sure you talk about like the ruling in the governing law. So whether it's the UCC or common law. Second, whenever you see a demand for insurance fact pattern, don't just ask, did they respond? Ask yourself, did the response actually assure performance, or did it just acknowledge the problem? If there's an assurance there, that means the contract is still in place. So hopefully this breakdown was helpful to you. Just wanted to mention I do have some books on Amazon. So a law student's guide to contract law and a law student's guide to law school essays. So definitely take a chance to take a look at those. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you.